My name is Kevin Wallis. I am a chemical engineer. I've been working these last 10 years or so at Abbott Diabetes Care in Alameda, and we make medical devices for detecting the level of glucose that's in somebody's blood. It usually requires a prescription to have that, but it's often indicated for people who are diabetic or pre-diabetic, or for whatever reason, their doctor feels that it's worthwhile to have the glucose monitored. I work in R&D in the chemical end of the sensor development group. And let's see, how would you like me to just describe it in general? Or do you have any questions that you'd like me to start with?
Yeah, sure. So maybe you could tell us in general kind of what you do, what that specifically entails.
Okay, so being in R&D is kind of a wide area. I actually do a lot of different things. Being a regulated industry, we have to get regulatory approval from the government, both in this country and in most countries around the world. So pretty much everything we do, starting from the development phase and through commercialization of any new or improved products, we have to monitor how the performance of our medical device is, and we have to make sure that each device that's manufactured really does meet all of its specifications. What that means for people with glucose is that it has to display and record what the blood glucose level is within plus or minus 10% on an ongoing basis. That's considered adequate in order to for people to monitor their diets and their exercise, which is the way that most people use to control their diabetes or their pre-diabetes, as is often the case. Some of the people who use our device actually are on insulin, and so it helps them to dose their insulin and to make sure that they don't overdose, which can actually be fairly serious if they do. So part of what I do involves running experiments on improvements that we want to make to our device. We just announced a couple of weeks ago a much smaller version of the device that's going to be sold in Europe first, and hopefully eventually in the US. And so we were involved in that. My role is basically to make sure that the raw materials that are used to make it, which are all chemical species, do what they're supposed to do, that the sensor as a whole operates properly, and that basically that the device will work as it should in the real world, in patients. I'm also responsible for writing reports on that, for filling out a whole wide variety of regulatory, or working with a regulatory group, I should say, in filling out a lot of paperwork for filings with the government. I work with suppliers a lot to make sure that we get everything that we need. And in general, we're always trying to improve what we're selling. So we're always trying to, to make the device work more accurately. Our goal, of course, is to, each year, a couple of years, to have it give responses faster and results that are more accurate. And what we're hoping in future is it can detect things beyond just glucose, but other, things of interest that might be in somebody's blood. For example, lactose, lactate is one of the things we're working on to, for people who are athletes, make sure that they're actually doing their exercise regime properly and things like that.
I just have one question. What
Sure.
made you choose this career? Like,
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm one of those people who always liked chemistry. I know it wasn't popular when I was in high school, and I don't know if that's still the case, but it may well be. I like chemistry, but I liked to have some real world applications. I kind of decided early on I didn't want to only do research on just discovering things, although that's kind of fun too, but to have it actually impact the world and help people. That's one of the good reasons to be in the medical industry in general. So that's why I went into chemical engineering. But I ended up double majoring as an undergraduate because I still like chemistry. That's something for anybody who's thinking of going to college in the near future, as many people may be, is to have a goal in mind, but also look for other areas of interest that you can combine with that. I think that's what's helped my job be very, very interesting over all of these years. And I should mention, I haven't always been in medical devices. That's just the last 10 years. Before that, I worked in other areas of chemical engineering. This field is actually very broad. The Bay Area has a lot of, pharmaceutical and medical device industry, but most chemical engineers work in the oil industry or in traditional chemical industries, or do a lot of other things that you might never expect. When I first started out, I worked in the agricultural products industry, and then they took on some pharmaceutical aspects. And then when that center closed in the Bay Area, instead of following it to the East Coast, I went to another company called Clorox that makes bleach and charcoal and cat litter, which after a few years of working in that area, so many people were teasing me about that. I figured it's time to go into something that sounds better. So I went into medical devices, first at Johnson & Johnson and finally at Abbott Diabetes Care. But that's the nice thing that I liked about chemical engineering, is that it lets you be very flexible and kind of change career direction. And a nice thing about having a broad background as you study in school is it lets you do a lot of things and keep your job interesting each day.
Is it easy to change from one field to another? Like if you wanted to switch if you didn't like it?
Relatively. I made probably the hardest switch, which was from a non-regulated industry to a regulated one. But in general, it's not so hard, especially if you've tried to not specialize too much when you were in school. I intentionally didn't get a PhD because I didn't want to essentially be seen as an expert in one field and not in any other field. That tends to happen to PhDs. So I got a master's degree, which is actually typical of engineers who want to be involved in R&D. And at that kind of a level, you can be both specific enough to be in R&D and also broad enough that it is easy to change. So yeah, I changed from like 3 very different kinds of industries over the last 20 or so years.
For your career, is it easy to find a job?
To find a job is easy. To be in the Bay Area is harder. The chemical industry doesn't have a very big presence in the Bay Area in general. The only big famous company in our area is Chevron. And depending on the business cycle, there's some years that they hire a lot of chemical engineers. There's others where other years they don't hire anybody. The year I got out of school, they weren't hiring anybody. So I went in a different direction.
so what exactly is a regulated industry?
Yeah, good question. You probably wouldn't have heard so much about that in school. Um, so certain industries are considered by the government to be important enough to people's health, or in some cases, the health of the economy, and that the government oversees and needs to give permission for you to do most things. So to sell, in this country, to sell a medical device or a pharmaceutical, you need approval. And in Europe, it's actually easier to get approval for those things. In the US, we have the most difficult approval system pretty much anywhere. And the theory, of course, is that it protects, patients here. But what it means is that we have to do about twice as much work as technically would be needed to bring a product to market and to sell it, because you have to do all of the technical work on having a good product, but then you have to prove it. And you can't just have good advertising and hope that people will buy your product, but you have to demonstrate through a series of protocols and validations that everything you say about it is actually true and downsides. So we have to show what's called safety and efficacy, meaning that, first of all, that it won't harm patients, and second, that it does what it says it does. So you can't just say it'll cure your headache or whatever you need, but that there's actual clinical data to demonstrate that in a statistically significant part of the population that it will do that.
I just had a quick question. So it's actually really interesting because for me right now, I'm in biotech and we just went over like how strenuous and how tiring like the whole clinical process is and how it takes many, many years. But hearing you talk about it, I just was wondering, like, is this more of a group work, or do you guys each get assigned a part and you have to fulfill it? Or yeah.
Sure. Well, since it's such a big effort, yeah, of course, we have actually several different groups working on it. There is a regulatory group who is responsible for the paperwork, and they kind of guide everybody else through the process because the laws are complicated. And lots of times it's not always a very black and white answer, are you good enough? It's up to basically the government inspector to say, hey, you've met everything. In addition to the regulatory group, there's usually the R&D group, which I'm in, and there'll usually be people in operations, those who actually make it. Because I can't just go in the lab and cook something up and test it and say, hey, it's good to go. We need to have it function in the lab, then be scaled up to production scale, and to make it at the actual manufacturing plant at large enough volume that it's representative of what will eventually be sold, and then have those tested. We usually try to have what's called in vitro testing, which is kind of standard lab testing. We want to make sure it's safe before we have it, try it out on people. And then if everything looks good, we'll recruit volunteers. At first, it's usually in-house volunteers, so we'll have employees kind of say, hey, I want to be part of a group of maybe a few dozen people that will try this out. And if it still looks good, then we'll go to outside clinical trials, and the regulatory group organizes that. But there'll be, at the end of the day, there'll be several dozen people involved in it in some larger or smaller way.
Yeah, so I know many of us here are juniors or sophomores, and we're going to be, applying for college, and we have to decide what major we want to be. So
Sure.
what were the steps you took in maybe high school and college, classes you've taken to get to this career?
Okay. When I was in high school, I kind of knew I liked science, but I wasn't sure exactly which area. When I was a freshman and a sophomore, I took kind of like a 2-year class called electronics, basically semiconductors and how transistors and integrated circuits work and how you design things. And that was a lot of fun. And then so that was always a potential career path. There was some software engineering was still early, but that was offered too, and I took some of that. In those days, when you wrote code, you had to punch it into a cardboard piece of, thick paper, basically like this, and there were a bunch of holes, and each of those cards would be one line of code. And so if you had 100 lines of code, you had 100 cards, and you would feed that into, the computer, and then a couple of minutes later, it would tell you that it didn't work and it aborted, and you need to fix some line of the code somewhere. And I realized that that was a useful tool, but that's not what I wanted to do. I took biology, and I thought that was interesting, and that ended up being really important. And as a junior and then a senior, I took a couple of years of chemistry and realized that is what I wanted to do. But nothing else that I took was wasted. Everything is used. Even though I'm in chemical engineering, biology is really important. The software and the hardware, science that I took was also really useful. I didn't take physics in high school, which was probably a mistake because it made it harder when I took it as a freshman in college, but that ended up being really important as well. There's, I would say that you may or may not have an area of interest that you like. If you have it, great. Still take a lot of other classes sort of related to it. If you're still not sure what you like, just take a wide variety of things and decide, partway through your college time. My daughter is facing exactly the same thing right now. She's interested in several things, but doesn't know what she's going to go in. And that's kind of the same advice for her is, take a variety of things, try to find your interest. You may find it in high school. More likely you'll find it in college because, as good as some of the courses are, or sometimes they're boring too, but in college they're better. If you thought you liked chemistry in high school, you'll probably like it more in college.
Oh, sorry, Lauren.
All right, okay, now I was just gonna say, that's super cool. So you mentioned that you were a senior, your role was a senior scientist. So
Right.
how exactly did you get to that position?
I started out as a junior engineer right out of school, which means that you do, back then we worked as teams just as today. But if you're a junior person, you do the things usually that other people don't want to do. But on the other hand, it's a good learning experience. Part of what chemical engineers do is to scale up processes. So we don't just go in the lab and mix chemicals and get some result, although you may start there, then you have to make it big and learn how what worked at the small scale can actually work at the large scale. That's often the most difficult part of the whole process. So that involves what we call pilot plant testing. So on big equipment, in my case, it was the company I worked for, this equipment was outdoors, and it often means working more than, well, to run it, it has to run for more than 8 hours. So we work in shifts. And so I'd usually get since I was the junior person, I'd usually get either the evening shift or sometimes the graveyard shift in the middle of the night. And that I remember some nights being outside at midnight, not always during the summer, just watching the equipment and adjusting things that need to be adjusted. And in a sense, it's sort of the dues you have to pay as a junior person. It's also a really great learning experience. And soon enough, after a few years, there'll be other people who are younger than you who take that role and you move up to the next thing. And it became, officially I'm a chemical engineer, but since I also majored in chemistry, sometimes my title has been scientist and sometimes it's been engineer. Yeah, at Abbott they call it. They do have engineers, but I'm in the, more of the chemistry group. And you move up basically by getting more experience and demonstrating that you can run a project. And once you can run a project kind of on your own, then you have other people helping you rather than you helping, more senior people. And then it gets more interesting at that point. And once you get old enough, they start calling you a senior scientist and something like that. But it helps, if you've had successful projects that accomplished something or became a product that sold in the industry, you can point to and say, hey, yeah, that product, that was, I either ran that or was a major part in the team that launched that. And that's how you get there.
So going back to going a little bit back to like studying different fields. So I know usually people say to study like what you study, like chemistry and biology, but I also heard that like some people who are interested in becoming like these types of researchers and like developing these type of medicinal stuff should consider taking like statistic classes or data analysis to help them understand. Is there any other fields that you would suggest us to take?
Statistics is important. I didn't take it in high school, but it's required in college for pretty much everything. If you haven't taken it, or even if you've taken it already, you'll still need it in college. I didn't take a formal statistics class. It was kind of built into most of the others. So freshman chemistry in college already, they'll teach you statistics if you haven't learned it already. And at some point, maybe not your freshman year, but at some point you start learning about experimental designs that have statistical power to them. So you can, by the time you graduate from college, you'll have a reasonable background in the theory. And then of course, once you get into the real world, then you learn the same thing over again, but from more of a practical point of view. So instead of doing the calculations for how to fit points to a line by hand or on a desktop computer, you'll have dedicated software that does everything for you. So you'll type in your data in a matrix and it will tell you what you want, which is, and usually don't get what you want. So you realize something went wrong, what do I need to change? And then eventually through a kind of an iteration process, you end up with a good design for your experiment. And then you run it, and then you find out what still went wrong, and then you fill in the gaps and do it again, and in the end you get a result that works. And it's that's part of what keeps it interesting.
Cool. So you said you also pursued a master's degree, and so just to kind of, how did that differ from your undergrad, and do you recommend pursuing a master's degree?
I think the key question is whether you want to go into R&D. If you're an engineer, bachelor's degree is fine for most areas of engineering, unless you want to go into R&D. In that case, some graduate level experience is really useful, often required. When my first job, it was at a company called AstraZeneca. They're actually working on a COVID vaccine now, although I'm not involved in that sort of thing these days. They hired a lot of PhD chemical engineers. It's actually very unusual. I was one of the few on site actually that only had a master's. But they used to brag, we have more PhDs on our site than anywhere except for UC Berkeley. And I don't know if they were exaggerating, maybe Stanford has as many, I'm not totally sure. But that's not the rule, that's kind of the exception. Most of the time, chemical engineers in R&D are master's level. And the reason is that at that level, you get exposure to many different aspects of chemical engineering, but haven't necessarily overly specialized in any of them. So for most people, that's, in R&D, that's probably the right level.
Thank you. I know like all of us were females, and I would say that's kind of not really unusual now, but it's kind of hard because we're interested in science and engineering, I would say. And so like, how about you? Like, what barriers or like adversity have you, or do you know other people have like faced in this, in meeting your career goals, such as like financial, racial, gender stereotypes?
Let's see. Well, I mean, going to college does cost some money. That's going to be an issue for most people. I had a campus job while I was an undergrad. And at the time it was kind of a pain because you have to work 10, 15 or 20 hours a week. At least that's what I did. We weren't actually allowed to work more than 20 hours a week while maintaining full-time student status, at least at that point. That's enough that it starts to impact your classes a little bit, so it makes it more challenging. On the other hand, when you get to interview for a real job afterwards, they ask, what kind of job experience do you have? And when they see that, it's a strong plus in your favor. So if you face some kind of a barrier like that, and most people do it in some way, if you're able to overcome it, that's, helps you a lot further down the road. That's in graduate school, depending on what field you're in, if it's a technical field, usually you can get either a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship. So I was in grad school 2 years and had one of each. And again, that takes time away from classwork and all of that, but it also gives you a lot of experience that's helpful. And that's also something that, employers value because they see that you're able to juggle several different things at the same time and come through it alive. And that's the kind of employee that they want. Other kinds of barriers, it's hard to say. It's sort of individual. When I was first hired out of school, we didn't have a lot of women in our group. We had about 40, I think, in our process development group at the time. Of those 40, probably 5 or 6. So there wasn't a lot. I don't know actually whether they felt barriers or not, but looking around my classes when I was an undergraduate, chemical engineering didn't have that many, right? It was probably 10 or 20% of most of my classes were female. So if you feel uncomfortable being in a situation where it's not more of a 50-50 ratio, then yeah, sure, that could be a barrier. I haven't myself experienced much beyond that, but on the other hand, knowing that you have to work for the next 3 hours and you've got a final exam the next day, that's, it's this sort of a difficulty that seems, worse at the time, but when you look back at it and say, hey, that helped, create, somebody who can actually work in the real world. So things aren't always necessarily bad, even though they sometimes seem that way at the time.
So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but what would you say a day in your life, particularly your career, would look like?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Actually, one of the things that I like the best is kind of depending on how I feel that day, I can usually kind of choose what to work on that day. Sometimes there's meetings and you just have to attend them, and too many meetings actually becomes the most boring part of the job. Fortunately, most people who run meetings realize that, and they try to keep them not too long and not too frequent. But apart from mandatory meetings, today, for example, well, because of the coronavirus, I've been home most of the time the last half year or so. But, once a week or once every 2 weeks, I will go in for half a day or something like that, just to kind of take care of things that need to be overseen. That's difficult to do from home. We're considered an essential business, and so we, actually since March, we've had permission to remain open as long as we follow certain rules. So this morning I had to go in to talk to a couple of the facilities people because I wanted to install a couple of environmental chambers that control temperature and humidity and allow us to run some experiments. And so we had to figure out how's the piping going to work. Do we have a source of tap water, of city water that can come into this room that can actually manage it? and how will we set up a water purification unit. And by the way, the outlet that's on the wall is for 110 volts and the equipment is 220 volts. How are we going to do that? Oh, there's some other lines behind the panel on the other side of the room that have 220 volt power. Let's, develop a plan for bringing it over and scheduling the electricians and all of that. So that was a lot of this morning. Well, we did have a group meeting that was an hour, and an hour is about as long as you want a meeting to be, without it dragging on too long. And then I came home, and this afternoon I have this, and then some other things. Part of what I can do from home very easily is paperwork, which sounds boring, but it involves, kind of pulling together data that several people have measured over the last couple of weeks and making sense out of it, right? Using statistics or in some manner pulling it together and saying, okay, these things were done, this is what it means, and this is what we think we should do as our next step. So that's not uncommon. Other days, I do go in the lab sometimes and, and do some work in there and pretend to be a chemist. And, I can do that too. And that's nice to do sometimes. And then I'm on the safety team. So we meet once a month or so and decide what improvements we need to make so that people don't fall down and hurt themselves or get ergonomic injuries, I should say, things like that. There's probably a dozen different things that all could be done. And so there's some flexibility to choose which we'll do today and which can be pushed off to tomorrow or next week. And I should mention, that's actually one of the advantages of being an engineer or a senior scientist or something like that, is you can have that flexibility of just deciding what's most important right now and what do I feel most ready to accomplish today. So if I don't feel like writing, I usually don't have to do today. I can maybe do it tomorrow or next week.
Cool. And then, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just mentioning writing. In high school, you don't always see how important English class is, but it turns out to be critically important. If you can write well or develop that skill and become good at writing, that's equally as important as your technical ability to advance to different levels, So to become a senior scientist or something like that, you need to write well and be able to, write in a way that's clear and effective, meaning that people can read it and come to a reasonable conclusion. Okay, so all the English classes that you may or may not like, those end up being equally as important, actually, as much as as the science you take. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You can go on. Or oh, okay. Speaking about like classes that you think are necessary to take, like I was just interested because so a couple of my sisters, they're in college and they had to study a lot of different coding languages since they're like studying statistics. So like studying like R or studying Stata. And I was just wondering, like, do you recommend anything in particular if we're interested in going into this career?
In statistics or in programming?
Just either overall.
Okay. Well, the statistics programs that I've used have usually been either Minitab or Jump. Minitab is kind of a general purpose, relatively easy to learn and powerful enough for 90–95% of the cases. So that's what people usually prefer to use, and it's nice and user friendly. Jump is more difficult, but once you learn it, it can do more things. Those are the two that are statistics programs that have worked for me. In terms of coding, I remember Fortran. we learned Fortran 4 when I was a student. I don't know if you guys have ever read about that in the history books, and some BASIC. When I was in grad school, I had to write some computer code to run a low temperature calorimeter, and that was done in BASIC. So even if you don't want to do computer programming, learn some, it's useful.
Yeah, so I think the most generic question is, what's your least favorite and what's your favorite part of your job?
Least favorite, oh, that's easy, it's commuting. I live in Castro Valley, so the commute isn't actually that bad, but there are days when it is. That's the part that I really liked about this stay at home, right? We still have to get the same amount of work done, but not having to commute makes it a lot easier. There's always days when things just go wrong. You run an experiment and you find out that the results are inconclusive. That's actually the worst outcome. If it's a failure, it's okay. You learn something from it and you move on. You change something and maybe try to improve it. If it works, then you feel great. If it's inconclusive, you don't really know what to do. You have to just take your best guess. And do I repeat it as is? Do I assume that it's not really working well enough? We have to change something fundamentally. So running experiments and getting an inconclusive result is probably the most frustrating part of it. As I say, you don't really know what the next step should be. So you have to take a risk and say, hey, I think we should do this, even though the path isn't clear. The most fun part is, I think when you can see a business need, when you can see, hey, our sensor, that measures the glucose level in blood would be a lot more useful to people if it could also do this, or if it had that property. Some of them are obvious, right? If it's, we say that it'll work for 14 days. If we could make it work for 21 days or 30 days or something like that, then that makes it better. So being able to kind of think ahead, what can we do differently? What materials would we use differently? What processing steps would we change to keep the sensor accurate over a longer period of time? There isn't a simple solution to it. It's usually a lot of little ideas that you try out, and maybe A and C and E kind of help and the others don't. So you pursue those and bring them further. And then you think about, oh, I never thought about G or H. Maybe those would help too. H doesn't work, but G does. And just kind of developing a path forward like that. That's one of the big rewards of the job, actually. After doing that for a year or two and seeing a result that actually works, and you can see that people are benefited by it. That's I think the biggest reward.
Cool. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay. If not, we have one more question actually. So just in general, if you had any advice to give to us high schoolers, what would it be?
Well, okay. So when I was in high school, I took science classes and the other required classes and stuff like that. But I was involved in some extracurricular activities as well. Sometimes they're related to coursework or what you hope to eventually do, and sometimes they're not. I was in track and field also, which was not related, or at least didn't seem related at the time. And I was on the math team, which was kind of related. And all those extracurricular activities, whether they seem related or not, actually end up being very important. Whatever, and the way I picked them was just what seemed interesting, and not too frivolous. You know, we had a bunch of clubs on campus, as you do, and some are, you know, more solid than others. I really like this, the one that you have, Science Speaks. It seems, you know, gives us an opportunity to talk, which is fun. And students who might be interested in a chance to, you know, think more about their future. Any clubs like that that you're a part of? Sports, I wasn't in music, but, you know, many people go into music. All of those are useful in ways that you may or may not see now. But when you look back, you can say, hey, you know, track and field didn't seem applicable to the future, but the kind of discipline that it takes to run long distances is kind of what it takes also to get through college and to handle the difficult days in the real world as well. Try to find areas that you think you're interested in, and if you can match them to something that serves or helps other people, that's great. When you can combine them both together, that's a good activity probably for you as a student, and maybe even in future when you get into the real world.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, last minute, any final questions? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think we're done then. Thank you so much for coming. I know everyone really appreciates it. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good luck this year. Hope you guys can at some point safely return to class.